The leak was in the return pipe of the kiddie pool, behind the drywall panel nobody had opened in about 3 years. I already knew where it was going to be before I even got it open. There's a specific smell when standing water meets old insulation. Not rot exactly. More like fabric that forgot to dry, multiplied across entire walls. You learn to recognize that smell after 11 years in the same building. Marcus had left maybe 20 minutes before. I heard the front door slam, heard his car engine turn over with that rough start he never got fixed, and then it was just the silence of the gym after closing. That silence has its own texture. It's not quiet the way a bedroom is quiet. It's full of structure. The hum of the ventilation system, the click of the fluorescents, the sound of the pool filter working at a rhythm that after enough time you stop hearing from hearing it so much. I went to get the tools from the back storage room and took longer than I should have, because someone had stacked the chlorine supply boxes in front of the shelf where the pressure gauges are kept. Deb does that. She swears she doesn't, but she does. I thought about texting her right then just to complain. Not because it would have made any difference. She'd deny it. I'd drop it. The whole thing would die the same way it always dies. The drywall panel opened with resistance. The moisture had swollen the frame. Inside, the return pipe had a longitudinal crack about 6 inches long. Not a clean break. A fracture that looked like material fatigue. That kind of thing doesn't happen overnight. It sits there for years building up pressure, until one day the drywall on the outside starts going dark, and you only notice when there's already seepage in the floor. I was lying on the ground on my side, trying to fit the clamp into the right position, when the fluorescents in the hallway flickered once. Just once. Came right back to normal. I didn't pay it any attention. That circuit had been having a contact issue for weeks. Already had it on the list. The chlorine smell inside the hallway was stronger than it should have been for that hour. The automatic dosing system sometimes pushes out more than it needs to when the temperature drops. Makes your eyes sting a little if you stand still long enough. I finished tightening the clamp, tested it with my hand, felt solid. I'd need to monitor it for a few days to make sure it wasn't losing pressure somewhere else. I started putting the tools away. Knee aching the way it aches when you spend too long on a concrete floor with no padding. I've got a knee brace somewhere in that storage room that I never use because I always think I won't need it and I'm always wrong. Then a noise distracted me. A locker closing. The sound of metal meeting metal, that specific muffled click from the men's locker room lockers, which are the oldest ones in the building and never close right on the first try. You have to apply pressure, pull up slightly while you push. If it closes with that specific click, it's because someone closed it. I went still. The men's locker room is at the end of the hallway that runs along the side of the pool. About 12-15 feet from where I was. The acoustics in that hallway are strange. Sound travels in a non-linear way because of the metal ceiling liner. Sometimes you think you're hearing something nearby that's actually on the other side of the building. I got up slowly without making noise, which is ridiculous to think about now. Why would I have gone quiet? Habit, I guess. When you hear something unexpected inside an empty building, the first instinct isn't to call out. It's to stop making noise yourself so you can listen better. I stood there listening for about 30 seconds. Nothing. Then came the second sound. The wooden bench dragging across the locker room floor. It wasn't quick, wasn't an accidental bump. It was slow, seemed deliberate. The heavy friction of something being shifted carefully like it was looking for position. The locker room floor is old ceramic tile, uneven, and the bench drags with a characteristic resistance I know well, because I've replaced the rubber feet on it twice. That sound wasn't the bench falling. It was the bench being moved by weight. I walked to the entrance of the hallway. I needed to check if it wasn't some troublemaker. It's happened before, whole teams breaking into the opposing team's locker room. In that moment, I just thought I didn't want to be in the middle of a mess. The fluorescents were on. Wet floor from normal use. Tracks of damp footprints that Marcus or someone from the last group had left behind. Smell of cheap deodorant mixed with the background chlorine. The men's locker room door was closed, the way it should be. I stood there staring at it. There was a gap about an inch wide at the bottom, standard ventilation. From where I was standing in the hallway, I could see the reflection of the ceramic tile inside, through the safety mode fluorescents that stay on inside. Nothing moved in that gap, but the air coming from under the door was warm. Not lukewarm. Warm. The heat of a body in an enclosed space that had been closed too long. I stood there in a strange way. Almost a trance, if you consider how long. Then I went to get my phone from the pocket of the jacket I'd left in the storage room. When I came back to the hallway, the gap under the door was dark. The interior light of the locker room had gone out. I stood in the hallway longer than I want to admit. A second time, not by choice. That part is still hard to explain. There's something that happens when you work in an enclosed space for years. You learn the difference between normal silence and wrong silence. Normal silence has layers. The pool filter, the storage room fan, the irregular click of old fluorescents. Wrong silence is when those layers disappear one by one, without you noticing, and you only realize it when you're already surrounded by something that has no texture at all. This was the second kind. I walked to the locker room door and knocked twice with my knuckle, even with the worry about troublemakers. Deep down, I was already convincing myself that wasn't it. The sound came back hollow, the way it always does on a hollow core door. I waited. Nothing on the other side responded. No movement, no voice, no sound of someone shifting or getting ready to open up. I pulled the key ring off my belt, found the men's locker room master by feel, and opened it. The interior light wasn't off. It was working normally. The two fluorescent tubes on the ceiling in safety mode, exactly as they should be. I stood in the doorway for a second, trying to figure out what I'd seen through the gap before. Maybe a shadow. Maybe some angle I hadn't caught. I looked at the floor. The gap under the door was in the right position. The reflection of the tile showed up clean from where I was standing. I went in. The locker room is L-shaped. The entrance opens into the row of lockers along the left wall. 16 units. Gray paint peeling at the hinges. Numbers stuck on with tape that half of them had already lost. The bench runs down the middle, parallel to the row. In the back, past the bend of the L, are the shower stalls and the two bathrooms. The bench had been moved, not by much. About 1.5 feet from where it always sits. I know because it has to be parallel to the grout line on the floor, and I'm the one who straightens it whenever someone accidentally pushes it out of place. It was turned slightly, the right end angled out, like something had leaned against it from the side and slid. I crouched down and looked underneath. Dust, 2 bottle caps, a forgotten sock that had been there a while. Nothing that explained the shift. I examined the floor around the bench. There were no wet footprints beyond the normal use ones, spread out near the lockers and the entrance. But there was something on the tile near the end of the bench that I almost missed. A dark stain in the grout, wide with irregular edges. It wasn't water. It had the texture of dried mud, the kind that cracks when you run your finger through it, but denser, darker than any mud I'd ever seen come into that gym. And it wasn't spread out like a footprint. It was concentrated in one spot, like something had stood there long enough to let it dry. I went around the bend of the L. The shower stalls had the curtains drawn. 4 stalls, 4 plastic curtains closed. That wasn't right. The routine after the last group is to open all the curtains to ventilate and keep the mold down. Marcus knows the routine. Deb knows it. Any instructor who closes up the gym knows it. I opened the first curtain. Empty stall, clean drain, dry walls. Second, same. Third, same. In the fourth, the back wall had a mark that wasn't from water. It was a shallow groove about 1 foot long running diagonally, like something hard and irregular had been dragged against it with force. The tile hadn't broken, but the grout had come out in a thin line along the groove. I ran my finger along it. The loose grout was still there, crumbled to dust. It got colder when I stood up. Not the air conditioning kind of cold. This gym doesn't have AC in the locker rooms, just passive ventilation. It was the kind of cold you feel when the warmth that was in a space suddenly leaves. 30 seconds earlier, I'd noticed heat coming from under the door. Now the stall smelled like wet concrete and something I couldn't name right then. That smell stayed with me. I tried to match it to something familiar, and what came was second-rate meat left in the packaging too long. That ferrous undertone that isn't rot yet but is getting there. I got out of the stall fast. I didn't run. I refused to run. I went back to the lockers and checked the hinges along the whole row. Locker 12 looked different. The top hinge had a small bend, almost imperceptible, like the door had been closed with more pressure than the mechanism was built to handle. Not a punch kind of force, more like weight applied downward while it was closing. The paint around the hinge had cracked in a small arc. That locker had been locked when I opened the gym that morning. I remember because the key to that latch used to stick, and I'd made a mental note to lubricate it. I never did. It was still locked now. I went to the entrance, put my hand on the doorframe, and looked over the entire locker room one last time before turning off the main light and closing up. The bench was the way I'd left it, slightly out of place, the end angled out. I thought about straightening it. I didn't. I can't say exactly why. Maybe I wanted to know if it would be different the next time I looked. I closed the door and went to finish the maintenance report in the small office by the front desk. I filled in the incident field with check locker 12, hinge appears overloaded, and left it at that. I didn't write anything about the bench. I didn't write anything about the smell. Some things you put in the report because they need a follow-up. Others you hold on to see if they happen again before you decide what to do with them. The next morning I got in earlier than I needed to. I'm not going to pretend it was for any professional reason. There was nothing urgent. The clamp on the pipe was holding. The report was filled out. My to-do list was the same as any other week. I left home early because staying home meant continuing to think. And continuing to think meant reaching conclusions I wasn't ready to reach yet. The gym was closed, the front dark, a light drizzle leaving the concrete with that washed-out look. I came in through the side hallway, turned on the reception lights, went straight to the men's locker room without passing through any other room. The bench was in the same position I'd left it. I crouched down and looked at the dark stain in the grout. Still there. I scraped at it with the flathead screwdriver I'd brought in my pocket. It came off in flakes, leaving the grout underneath clean. It hadn't soaked in. It was just deposited on top, like sediment. I saved a piece in a plastic bag. Never sent it for any kind of analysis. It's still in the drawer of my office. Every time I open that drawer and see the bag, I close it again without lingering. Deb came in at 9. I asked in passing if anyone had stayed in the building after hours besides me and Marcus. She did that pause she does when she suspects a question has more behind it than it looks, and then asked if something had happened. I said no. Minor irregularity in the locker room, probably someone who stayed late without logging it. She checked the system and texted me the record. 32 check-ins throughout the day, all clocked out before closing. Marcus had been the last one out. I did maintenance on the faucets in the women's locker room through the morning. Repetitive work that leaves your mind idle. It's not a bad thing when you want to stop thinking. Only sometimes an idle mind goes exactly where you were trying to avoid. What stayed with me was the heat. That heat under the door the night before. Passive ventilation doesn't build up that kind of warmth in an enclosed space. To get that temperature, you'd need an active source, or body mass, body heat, in a locker room that was empty. I stopped working on the faucets twice just to stay quiet and listen to the building. Nothing. Just the pool filter and the fluorescent with the contact issue. I called Ray Tillman early in the afternoon. Ray had been a founding partner of the gym before selling his share 8 years ago. He still comes in sometimes to use the weight room because he says he can't work out somewhere he doesn't know. The real reason I called him is that Ray spent 30 years as a firefighter. Doesn't panic, doesn't exaggerate. He's the kind of person you call when you want someone to listen to what you have to say without starting in with questions you don't know how to answer. I told him about the bench being moved, about the stain. I didn't mention the heat. To this day, I don't know why I left that part out. Maybe because it was the part I could least rationalize. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I'd checked the maintenance corridor ceiling. In buildings like this one, he said, there's a space between the drop ceiling and the slab that sometimes connects areas that shouldn't connect. An animal, an intruder, whatever it might be, could be moving around up there without ever touching the floor. I hadn't checked. Above the ceiling tiles was an old metal framework, cross beams and conduits wide enough to support a lot more weight than that cheap drop ceiling suggested. The tiles weren't the floor. They were just the fragile skin hiding the space something could move through. He said he'd stop by early the next day. I hung up and went to the maintenance corridor. I stopped in the middle and looked up at the ceiling. Compressed foam tiles, 2-foot square panels. Standard for gyms like this one. Cheap, easy to install, gives way under any pressure from below. 2 tiles were slightly out of place. One of them had a diagonal crack in the corner, like the material had buckled under weight concentrated on a single point. I stood under them longer than I was able to explain afterward. The hallway was quiet. The pool filter worked at its usual rhythm. The fluorescent with the contact issue clicked once, then steadied. But there was a smell I hadn't noticed before in that corridor. Faint, almost nothing. That ferrous undertone I'd caught in the shower stall the night before, meat with a metallic edge, the kind of smell that doesn't come from any piece of equipment and doesn't come from any moisture. It was coming from above. I looked again at the displaced tiles and noticed that one of them hadn't fallen. It had been pushed downward from above, one edge lower than the other, as if something had moved across it with enough weight to sink the foam without breaking through. I left the corridor. I went to the front desk, sat in Deb's chair because mine was buried under a box of documents I still hadn't filed, and stared at nothing for a few minutes. Deb had already left. The gym was quiet again, just the last few afternoon members getting ready to head out. Marcus passed through the reception area with his bag on his shoulder and asked if I was okay. I said I was. I asked if he'd noticed anything strange the night before he left. He stopped. Actually thought about it, not the way people think when they're just being polite. Then he said, "There was a weird smell near the locker room entrance. I figured it was the drain," and asked if I could take a look at that later. I asked what kind of smell. He made a face. "I don't know. Something old, like somebody left meat thawing next to a heater." He left without adding anything. I sat with that. Ray got there before me. He was outside when I arrived, leaning against the brick wall near the side entrance with a cup of coffee in his hand, his flannel jacket buttoned up to the neck. 60 years old, shoulders still broad, that way of standing still that looks like rest but isn't. It's attention. I'd learned the difference over the years. We didn't exchange much. I unlocked the door, he came in, went straight to the maintenance corridor without me needing to show him the way. He looked up at the ceiling, examined the displaced tiles, ran his finger along the diagonal crack in the foam. Then he went to the men's locker room, walked in, stood in the middle for a moment with his arms crossed, just looking. "Bench was moved," he said. It wasn't a question. "That bench is heavy, built to stay put and hold up under people stretching on top of it." "Yeah." He crouched down, examined the floor, ran his hand near the area where the stain had been. I'd already scraped it off, but the spot still had a slightly different shade from the rest of the grout. Lighter, like a scar on the tile. I said nothing about the smell. Not because I forgot, because when we were inside the locker room that morning, there was nothing. Closed locker room air, background chlorine, the faint mildew of old walls. Normal. And that normalcy was almost more unsettling than the smell itself, because it meant the thing, whatever it was no longer there. It had been, and it had gone somewhere else inside the building. Ray checked the shower stalls, opened each curtain slowly. He stopped at the 4th stall, looked at the diagonal groove in the tile I'd found before. He ran the pad of his thumb along the mark without saying anything. Then he stood up, turned to me, and asked what I hadn't told him over the phone. I told him about the heat under the door. He went quiet, looked up at the ceiling of the stall for a few seconds like he was calculating something. Then he said he'd come back later, that he wanted to see the building at night with everything locked up, that some things only make sense in the context where they happened. I agreed without fully understanding what he expected to find. But I was curious too. At that point I remember I still wasn't scared, but curious, yes. I spent the day doing what I always do. Maintenance list, filter system check, replacing a light in the women's bathroom that had been flickering for days. That routine you learn to run on autopilot after enough time, where your hands work and your head is somewhere else. That day my head kept going back to the maintenance corridor ceiling, to the displaced tiles, to whatever path something would have taken moving across that thin foam above. The gym closed as usual. Marcus left, gave a wave without saying anything because he was on the phone. Deb shut down the front desk computer, picked up her jacket, asked if I needed anything else before she headed out. I said no. Ray showed up 40 minutes after closing. He brought a good flashlight, the kind with a wide beam that lights up a room instead of just throwing a cone. I wondered why we wouldn't just turn on the lights. That's when I started to understand something was off, and that it might be something hard to sit with. We went to the maintenance corridor first. He turned on the flashlight aimed at the ceiling, and we both stood there looking at the foam tiles in silence. The crack I'd seen had gotten bigger. It wasn't just a diagonal line in the corner anymore. It was a web of fractures radiating from the center point, like pressure applied repeatedly to the same spot. The foam around it was compressed, the surface uneven where it had been flat before. That happened today, Ray said. Also, not a question. We went to the locker room. I opened the door, turned on the safety light, took 2 steps in and stopped. The bench was back in its original position, parallel to the grout line, centered, exactly the way it was always supposed to be. I'd left it out of place on purpose 2 days before. I wanted to see if it would change. It had changed, but not the way I expected. It wasn't out of place anymore. It was perfectly aligned, as if someone had taken the trouble to straighten it, to fix it, to leave everything the way they'd found it. Ray stayed in the doorway, watching without coming in. I went to the back, rounded the bend of the L, opened the stalls one by one. 3 empty. In the 4th, the curtain was drawn the way I'd left it. That's when the pool filter stopped. Not gradually. It stopped. The constant hum that exists as the background of every sound experience in that building simply cut out, and the silence that remained had a physical weight I don't know how to describe any other way. It's like when you spend too long near a loud machine and it shuts off. The silence hurts your ears a little. I heard the breathing. It was coming from the ceiling, not from the hallway, not from the stalls, from the ceiling of the locker room itself, from above the drop tiles. Rhythmic, heavy, with a long interval between inhale and exhale that wasn't a human interval. Humans breathe faster than that. This thing breathed like air cost something, like every cycle was a decision. I didn't move. Ray was at the locker room entrance, motionless with the flashlight aimed at the ceiling. The wide beam lit up the foam ceiling tiles, and on one of them, right in the center of the room, the surface was curving slightly downward. Not giving way. Curving. The distributed pressure of something static above it, live weight holding still. Then the tile opened a crack. It didn't fall. It opened, shifted to the side carefully, slowly, one edge lifting while the other sank, exactly the way a hand would lift a lid to see what's underneath. What appeared in the gap wasn't a face. It was the side of something, a profile. Skin stretched over a structure that didn't arrange itself the way human bone arranges. Too long, the angles wrong, as if the proportions had been worked out with a different ruler. There was fur in tufts, not covering, dotting, appearing in patches between regions of smooth, very taut skin. And an eye. Just one, visible at that angle. It had no dramatic shine, no impossible color. It had the flat reflection of something alive in a dark space. The reflection animal eyes make when light catches them from the side. It was looking down, at me. It lasted no more than 3 seconds. The tile went back into place with the same calm it had been lifted with, and the heavy breathing continued for another moment before it started to move, the sound shifting toward the far end, growing more distant, disappearing behind some wall I couldn't map. The pool filter came back on. Ray and I stood where we were for a length of time I can't measure. Then he lowered the flashlight, looked at me, and said only, "You need to close this building tonight." I didn't argue. We closed up the building without talking much. Ray checked every entrance while I shut down the systems. Filter, heating, security lights. We worked fast and in silence, the way 2 people work when they're running the same numbers in their heads, and neither one wants to be the first to say the answer out loud. Outside, in the empty parking lot, the cold air came into my lungs like something solid. I stood still for a moment, just breathing. Ray stood beside me, hands in his pockets, looking at the building with that expression he gets when he's organizing information before he lets it go. I asked him what he thought it was. He stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said he didn't know what it was, but he said he knew what the building was and that those two things might not be separate. We went to his car. He didn't start the engine. We sat there with the windows slowly fogging while he talked. The land where the gym was built had belonged for decades to a family called Vantry. Ray knew the story because when he and the other partners bought the lot in the 90s, the title process stalled for nearly 8 months because of an inheritance dispute nobody had seen coming. Their lawyer had to research the entire chain of ownership, and what he found wasn't in any obvious place. The land had been used as a private slaughterhouse from the 40s through the early 60s. Not the industrial kind, registered, with health inspections. The kind that exists because a family has enough land, enough animals, and enough absence of oversight. The Vantrys raised cattle and hogs, and the processing happened in a wood frame structure that sat exactly where the locker room block and the maintenance corridor stand today. That alone was nothing. Family slaughterhouses were common in that area back then. The problem was what had happened in '62. Ray spoke slowly, choosing his words. One of the Vantry sons, a man named Gerald, had been found dead inside the processing structure in the winter of that year. The official cause was a workplace accident, blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from heavy equipment. The case was closed fast, but their lawyer, digging through county records, found a witness statement from a neighbor that had never been formally incorporated into the proceedings. The neighbor described having heard sounds coming from the Vantry structure on the nights before Gerald's death, sounds he couldn't classify as any animal known to the area. He described them as vocalizations, low, rhythmic, with long pauses. With that, they believed Gerald had been running, trying to get away from something, until in his desperation he fell inside the structure. The family shut down the slaughterhouse shortly after, sold the cattle, tore down the wood structure, left the land empty for decades until the sale in the 90s. Ray stopped. I asked if the lawyer had found anything else. He said yes, that in the county health records from the 50s, there were 3 hospitalizations of different Vantry family members with similar descriptions. Deep lacerating wounds, origin not clearly documented, attributed in general terms to animal accidents. 2 of them had been discharged. One had never left the hospital. The silence inside the car got heavier. I told Ray that was old history, that the land had been paved over, built on, that 11 years of community gym had happened on top of all that without anything out of the ordinary. He agreed, said yes, 11 years of nothing, and then he asked if I'd noticed when the signs had started. Not in terms of the day, but in terms of context. What had changed in the building recently? I thought about it. The only thing different in the past few weeks had been the partial renovation of the utility basement, a shallow, restricted access space that sat under the maintenance corridor. The city had required a foundation inspection as part of a compliance program for older community buildings. The inspection crew had opened 3 access points in the corridor floor, gone down, spent 2 days down there with measuring equipment, then sealed everything back up and issued the report. That had happened 3 weeks ago. Ray stared straight ahead for a moment. Then he said, in that voice of his that never goes up or down, "You know what sits under concrete that was poured over packed earth that was used for decades to process meat? It wasn't a question. Blood doesn't go away, not the way we'd like it to. It seeps down, saturates the soil, stays. Decades of slaughter in a concentrated space leave a layer in the ground that no foundation inspection documents, because it's not what they're looking for. And when you open up the floor and let it breathe again, when the air from below rises and the smell that had been contained for decades finds a way out." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I'm not saying a smell brought that thing. Doesn't work like that, it's not that simple, and I'd be dishonest if I turned it into an explanation that closes neatly. But something disturbed something. The inspection crew opened the floor, spent 2 days working down there, sealed it back up. And 3 weeks later, I was lying in the corridor fixing a pipe and hearing a wooden bench dragging across the empty locker room next door. I don't know if those things are connected. I just know the sequence exists. Ray said he'd make some calls in the morning. Former colleagues from the fire department, someone at the county who owed him a favor. He didn't promise anything. He just said he wanted to understand the size of the problem before deciding what to do with it. I asked what I should do with the gym. He actually thought about it. Then he said that closing without an explanation would raise questions I wasn't prepared to answer. That keeping it open during the day with people around, with activity, was probably safer than leaving the building empty for long stretches. That the problem didn't seem to be the gym when it was full. It seemed to be the gym when it was empty. I went home. I ate something I don't remember. I sat in the living room with the TV on and no sound for maybe an hour, watching the picture move without processing any of it. Then I went to sleep because there was nothing more useful I could do at that point. Only before I went to sleep, I did something I hadn't done since I moved into that house. I closed and locked every window. Not because they were open. I just needed to know they were locked before I could close my eyes. Ray didn't call in the morning. I called him at 10 and it went straight to voicemail. I texted him, no response. I didn't panic about it. Ray is the kind of person who goes dark for hours when he's working something out, phone in his pocket without looking at it. I've seen him go a whole day without responding to anything and show up at night with everything sorted and a 3-sentence explanation. I opened the gym at the usual time. Deb came in, turned on the computer, made coffee. The first morning members filed in, bringing the smell of cold outside air mixed with that gym smell. That's always the same everywhere. Rubber from the equipment, old sweat, the faint chemical of cleaning products. Normal. Completely normal. Marcus didn't show up. He had a weight training class at 8. The 4 students who were waiting stood by the door of the room for 15 minutes before Deb came to get me. I tried his cell twice. Nothing. I texted him saying I needed confirmation that he had students waiting. I covered the class myself, which was awkward because I'm not an instructor and all 4 of them knew it. I did what I could, ran through the exercises posted on the wall, pretended everything was fine. At 11:30, with the gym running normally, I went to the men's locker room. I needed to check. I hadn't been able to get in since the night before when Ray and I left quickly. I wanted to see it in daylight, with people in the building, with the pool filter running and voices echoing from the hallway. I opened the door. The bench was out of place again. This time more than before, almost perpendicular to the row of lockers, the end pressed against the opposite wall. And on the floor, between the bench and the entrance to the hallway that bent toward the back, there was a sequence of marks that stopped my thinking completely. They weren't footprints. They didn't have any defined footprint shape. They were irregular pressure points on the ceramic tile, unevenly spaced, as if the weight didn't land the same way each time, sometimes more to one side, sometimes concentrated in a smaller area, sometimes spread too wide. The tile hadn't broken, but the grout between the pieces was dark along the entire sequence. That same dense coloring I'd scraped up 2 days before. I followed the marks with my eyes. They went all the way to the bend of the L. I walked slowly, rounded the corridor, entered the stall area. The first curtain was open, the stall empty. The second open, the third open. The fourth was closed, the plastic curtain motionless, no draft to move it. I stood in front of it for a moment. There was a smell. The same ferrous smell as before, but stronger now, denser, with a layer underneath it that I can't describe without sounding like I'm exaggerating. It's the kind of thing you sense and your brain processes before your conscious mind does. Some ancient mechanism that exists to warn you that what's in front of you is not safe to approach. I opened the curtain. The stall was empty, but on the back wall, on the tile that already had that diagonal groove I'd found before, there were new marks. Not grooves. Pressures. As if something very large had stood there for a long time, its weight distributed unevenly across the surface, leaving where the pressure was greatest a different coloring on the tile. And along the bottom edge of the wall, where it meets the floor, there was a dark accumulation that wasn't mud and wasn't water. It was thick, almost black, with edges that had already started to dry and crack. I turned around, left the stalls, left the locker room, closed the door behind me, went to the staff bathroom, washed my face with cold water, stood looking at the mirror for a moment without any specific thought. Then I tried Marcus again. This time he picked up. His voice was different. Not hoarse, not groggy. Different in a way that's hard to name. Flat. Like he was speaking from somewhere very far from where the phone was. I asked where he was. He said he was at home. I asked if he was okay. He said he was. I asked why he hadn't shown up. He was quiet for a moment before saying he'd decided not to come in. I said his students had been waiting, that I needed notice, that it was basic. He said, I went back. I asked what he meant by that. After I left last night, I went back. I forgot my phone charger in the instructor's room. I came in through the side entrance. You were still here. I went quiet. I went to get the charger, he continued in that flat voice. And I heard something in the hallway. I thought it was you. I went to look. He stopped. Marcus. It wasn't you. I didn't ask what it was. I asked what he had seen. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to think the call had dropped. Then he said, slowly, like someone describing something they're seeing for the first time as they speak. It had its back to me, in the maintenance corridor, standing still, leaning against the wall, too tall. I thought it was some stranger. I stood there waiting for it to turn around. Another pause. It didn't turn around, but it knew I was there. I could tell when it realized because it went even more still. You know how something goes quiet because it's paying attention? It's different from regular quiet. I said I knew. I left. I didn't run because I couldn't. I walked out and didn't look back and got in my car and drove away. I asked if he was hurt. He said no. I asked if he'd seen the face. He said there was no face to see, that what was turned toward him was the back of the head, and that the back of the head wasn't arranged the way a human head is arranged, that the skull rose too high, that the back of the neck ran too long, that the neck was wide where a neck isn't usually wide. After that, he didn't say anything for a while. When he came back, his voice had shifted again, closer now, more present, like he'd just stepped back into his own body. He said he wasn't coming back to the gym. He said I shouldn't come back either. I hung up. I stood there with the phone in my hand in the staff bathroom, the mirror in front of me, the pool filter humming in the background, the muffled noise of the noon members using the equipment in the main room. Ray still hadn't responded. Ray showed up at 2 in the afternoon. He didn't call first. He was just there when I came out of the equipment room, standing in the hallway, the same clothes as yesterday, an expression on his face I hadn't seen on him before. Not exactly fear. It was the kind of thing that shows up on someone's face after they've spent a whole night trying to fit a piece of information somewhere it doesn't fit. I asked where he'd been. He said he'd gone to the county archives to check the records the lawyer had found back in the 90s. Ray still had notes from that old title search, yellowed copies and scrawled names in an envelope he'd never thrown away. He wasn't going in blind. He knew which last names, dates, and case numbers to request. He'd stayed until they closed and come back when they opened in the morning. What he found didn't change anything we already knew, but it confirmed the full extent of it. The Vantry hospitalization records were 5, not 3 like he'd said before. 5 family members over 15 years, all with deep lacerations, all attributed to animal accidents, all occurring in winter months. The one who never left the hospital was a 43-year-old man who had been admitted with the entire left side of his chest torn open. The medical report described the wounds as inconsistent with any domestic or wild animal common to the region. We were quiet for a moment. Then I told Ray about Marcus, about the phone call, about what he'd seen in the maintenance corridor, about his flat voice describing the back of a head that wasn't arranged the right way. Ray listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said we needed to check the entire building before closing, that he couldn't let another night go by without knowing where that thing was moving during the day. I pushed back. I said the most sensible thing was to close the gym, call the right authorities, hand it off to someone with proper equipment and training. Ray agreed it was the most sensible thing, and then he asked what I was going to say when they asked me what I'd seen, how I was going to describe it, what I expected to happen afterward. I didn't have a good answer to any of the 3 questions. We waited for the gym to empty out. Deb left at 5 after the last members. We locked the front entrance from the inside. Ray stayed at the front desk while I went through the building systematically. Weight room, classroom, storage, staff bathrooms. All empty. All normal. We met up in the hallway leading to the locker rooms. The hallway was quiet. The foam ceiling tiles had more fractures than the night before. The pattern had spread to 3 tiles now, the surface uneven, compressed from above at multiple points. There was a stain on the ceiling between the tiles that wasn't moisture. Dark with dry edges, the same kind I'd found in the shower stall and on the locker room floor. Ray pointed at the men's locker room door. The gap under the door was dark, safety light out even with the system on. I stood in front of the door for a moment. There was a clear logic telling me not to open it. An equally clear logic said that leaving whatever was in there without knowing what was happening in that space, without having any concrete information about what to do next, was a different kind of danger. I opened the door. The smell hit before anything visual. Dense, warm, ferrous, with that underlying layer my brain kept refusing to name. The heat was real and immediate, like opening the door to a sealed room in summer. Except it was winter, and that locker room had no heating of its own. I turned on the flashlight. The bench was in the center of the locker room, perpendicular to everything with no logical position. Around it the floor was covered in dark marks. Not a sequence now, an area, as if something had stood there and moved in a tight circle repeatedly. The lockers on the left wall had marks on the metal surfaces. Not dented, not forced open. Contact marks, lateral pressure, something that had passed too close. Ray stayed at the entrance. I went in. I moved slowly toward the bend of the L, the flashlight aimed toward the back. All the stalls had their curtains open. Empty. It was the ceiling that gave way. Not the stall ceiling. The ceiling of the corridor between the stalls and the entrance. The foam tile that was right above where I'd just walked. It gave downward with the sound of compressed material that isn't a crash. It's a sinking. And before I'd processed the sound, there was already something in the corridor behind me. Not between me and the exit. Behind me, at the far end, between me and the stalls. I turned slowly. The flashlight shook because my hand shook, and the beam cut through the corridor unevenly before I could steady it. It was too large for that space, not in a way that broke physics, in a way that made the space feel wrong, like proportions calculated for somewhere else. It was slightly hunched, shoulders angled inward to fit between the walls, head tilted because the ceiling couldn't accommodate its full height. Bipedal, as I'd gathered from the eye in the gap. But the verticality was different from human. The center of gravity higher, the torso too long relative to the legs. The skin where it showed between tufts of fur was taut and pale, almost translucent near the joints, and the joints were all too prominent. Knees, elbows, shoulders, all with that angularity of something that grew too fast for its casing to keep up. It didn't move. It stood still, slightly hunched, and looked at me. Not with both eyes. With one because the head was slightly turned, the elongated snout pointed in one direction while the visible eye stayed on me. There was no expression, no readable intent. There was attention, concentrated and complete, the kind that carries none of the signals we've learned to read in a human face. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then it went even more still. That stillness Marcus had described on the phone. The stillness of something at maximum attention. And the muscles in its neck contracted in a way that wasn't preparation for speech. It was preparation for movement. I threw the flashlight to the side and ran. Not toward the stalls, not toward the back. I ran into the main corridor, past where the thing had been before it completed its movement. Felt the displacement of air to my right like physical pressure. Heard the impact of something heavy against the tile wall where I'd been a second before. Ray shouted my name from the entrance. I came out of the locker room, slammed the door behind me, kept running. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. Ray was behind me. I don't know at what point he left the locker room. I don't know what he saw or didn't see before he got out. When I stopped in the parking lot and turned around, he was about 30 feet away, walking fast, jacket open, his breath visible in the cold air. He wasn't running. Ray doesn't run. He's the kind of man who decided at some point in his life that running is a way of losing control of the situation, and that keeping your pace means keeping your head. He reached me, stood still, looked at the building for a long moment. Then he said, "You're bleeding." I looked at my right arm. The sleeve of my jacket had a clean tear at the forearm, and through the tear the fabric underneath was dark. I hadn't felt anything. Sometimes I don't when the adrenaline is that high. The body decides the information isn't a priority and saves it for later. Later arrived when I pulled up the sleeve and saw the cut. Shallow, about 5 inches long, parallel to the bone, with clean edges that weren't from a fall or an impact. It was from a claw. I didn't say that out loud. I didn't need to. Ray saw it, understood, said nothing. He tore off a strip from the inside of his own shirt with a calm that unsettled me more than it should have, folded the fabric into a compress and pressed it against the cut. Told me to hold it. I held it. We both stood there looking at the closed building while I kept pressure on my arm, and the empty parking lot went quiet around us. The side door was closed. No sound coming from inside. Ray said we needed to make 2 quick decisions. First, my arm needed attention that wasn't negotiable. Second, what were we going to say when they asked what happened? I said I could say I'd slipped, that I'd caught a corner of exposed metal in the maintenance corridor. It wasn't impossible. It was the kind of accident that happens in an old building. Ray looked at me for a second. Then he said he wasn't asking about the cut. He was asking about the gym. What I was going to do with the gym. I had no answer. He drove me to the nearest urgent care in his car. I sat in the passenger seat with the cloth pressed against my arm, watching the reflection of the streetlights on the wet windshield, trying to organize what I'd seen in a flashlight-lit locker room 20 minutes earlier. The shape hunched to fit the space, the sideways eye, the contraction of the neck muscles before the movement, the displacement of air as I ran past it. I had run past it. I'd run toward it because it was the only direction that led to the exit, and it had moved late. A second, less than a second, and I'd gotten out with a cut on my arm instead of not getting out at all. I kept thinking about that interval. It wasn't slowness, it wasn't inability, it was a choice. Or the animal equivalent of a choice, which maybe is the same thing or maybe is something completely different, I don't know. Something in that moment made it not complete the movement. I don't take comfort in that. I note it because it's what happened. At the urgent care, they said the cut needed 8 stitches. The nurse who treated me asked how it happened without looking at me, in the tone of someone who's heard every possible version. I said I'd caught an exposed metal bracket at work. She wrote it down, cleaned it, sutured it, gave me a sheet with aftercare instructions and told me to come back in 10 days to have the stitches removed. Ray waited outside through all of it. On the way back, he insisted on taking me home. We were quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd made a decision while he was waiting, that he was going to call an old contact from the fire department who now worked in state wildlife control, that he was going to say the minimum necessary to get something official moving, without having to give explanations that neither of us could give coherently. I asked what the minimum necessary meant in this case. He said, large animal, aggressive behavior, community building, confirmed risk. Didn't need to be more specific than that to put someone responsible on the problem. I agreed because I didn't have a better alternative. When we pulled up in front of my house, Ray kept the engine running while I got out. Before I closed the door, he said something that stayed with me in a way I can't quite explain. He said that in 30 years as a firefighter he'd walked into a lot of places he didn't want to walk into, and that the difference between the ones who came out and the ones who didn't wasn't equipment or training or luck. It was knowing when a place was no longer yours. He said that gym was no longer mine. I closed the door. He drove away. I went inside, changed my clothes, washed my face. My forearm throbbed at a steady rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and my phone in front of me and stared at the phone without doing anything for a considerable amount of time. There was a message from Marcus, sent while I was at the urgent care. No text, just a photo. Before I opened it, I understood that he had gone back. Not to go inside. Marcus would not go back into that building after what he'd told me on the phone. But maybe he'd stopped across the street, without the nerve to leave for good. Caught in that stupid need people have to confirm whether the fear is still there when you put some distance between yourself and it. I waited a moment before opening it. It was a photo of the gym parking lot, taken from far away, from inside a car, the angle of someone parked on the opposite side of the street. Nighttime, grainy, the front of the building in the background with the lights off. On the side of the building, near the entrance Ray and I had used to get out, there was a dark shape leaning against the exterior wall, too large to be a person, motionless, with that shoulder angle I'd seen up close in the locker room corridor, turned inward, hunched, like something that had learned to reduce its own volume in spaces that weren't built for it. It was outside. I texted Marcus back asking when the photo had been taken. He responded immediately, "While you were still inside." I didn't sleep that night. It wasn't anxiety, insomnia. It wasn't nightmares. It wasn't any of the dramatic forms of not sleeping that people describe. It was simply that every time I closed my eyes, my brain went back to the photo Marcus had sent, and worked through the details of the image with an attention that during the day I could control, and at 3 in the morning I couldn't. The shape leaning against the exterior wall. The shoulders angled inward. The stillness of something that doesn't need to move because it already knows where everything is. At 6 in the morning I gave up, got up, made coffee. Ray called a little after 8. He said he'd spoken with the wildlife control contact. That the conversation had been more complicated than he expected. Not because the contact doubted him, but because the protocol for a formal report required an incident filing with a police report. And a police report required a description. And a description required me to say out loud what I had seen in a locker room corridor the night before. I asked what he had told him. He said he'd described it as a large animal, territorial behavior, confirmed presence inside a community facility, that the contact was going to check internally and get back to him. I asked how long. Ray was quiet for a second. Then he said he didn't know. That bureaucracy has its own pace, and that pace rarely lines up with what a situation calls for. I hung up and sat there with my coffee going cold in my hand. There was a practical question I'd been avoiding since the night before, and that I now had no way of avoiding any longer. The gym needed to open. Not opening raised questions. The management of the space was shared responsibility with a community association that met once a month, and that I had no way of reaching collectively on short notice, with an explanation that made any sense. Closing without documented justification triggered an administrative process. Keeping it open with what I knew was inside that building was a different and more serious matter. I went to the gym. I got there before Deb, before any members. I parked, sat in the car for a few minutes looking at the front of the building. The side entrance was closed the way I'd left it. No visible sign of anything. I went in through the main entrance, turned everything on, went through the building with a different kind of attention than usual. Not maintenance attention, which is technical and specific, but spatial attention. Attention to volume, to where the air was still and where it was moving. The weight room was normal. The classroom, normal. The storage room, normal. The maintenance corridor was different. There was nothing there. No presence, no smell, no new marks on the ceiling tiles. But the foam panels that had been fractured and compressed over the past few days were on the floor. Not fallen randomly, not scattered. Stacked. 3 panels, one on top of the other, arranged against the wall with a precision that wasn't accidental. I stood looking at the pile for a long time. That thing didn't seem to manipulate objects the way a person manipulates them. I knew that instinctively. There was no clean, organized intent, but those panels were stacked. Maybe they'd fallen that way by accident, by gravity, by some physical logic I wasn't seeing. Maybe I was looking for patterns in something that had no pattern. I moved away from the corridor. Deb came in at 10 to 9, tossed her jacket on the chair, turned on the computer, asked if I was okay because I was wearing the same clothes as yesterday. I said I'd had a long night, maintenance issue. She looked at me for a second with that expression of someone deciding not to ask anymore, and went back to her screen. The first members came in. The morning happened. At 11, Ray's contact called my cell directly. A man with a dry, efficient voice, who identified himself with a name and a title I won't repeat here. He said he'd checked the county wildlife records, and there was no large animal cataloged in the area that matched the description Ray had given him. He said that didn't mean absence. It meant absence of record. He said he was going to request an on-site inspection, that someone would be in touch to schedule it. I asked how long until the inspection. He said it depended on the queue, that it would probably be about a week. A week. I hung up, looked at the ceiling of the small office by the front desk where I was sitting, thought about a week of the gym running normally with that thing moving through the ceiling tiles and the locker rooms every night. I went to the men's locker room. I opened the door, turned on the light, went in. The bench was in the right position. The floor was clean, not mopped. Clean, as if the dark marks that had covered that tile over the past few days simply weren't there anymore. I went to the bend of the L, opened the stalls one by one. All empty, all walls unmarked. Stall 4 with no dark residue along the base. Nothing. I smelled the air carefully. Chlorine, deodorant, the old mildew of the walls. No ferrous undertone, no layer underneath that the brain refuses to name. I went back to the corridor. The panels were on the floor, one partially overlapping another, leaning against the wall in a way that could have been a fall, but didn't look like a fall. I climbed up on a chair, aimed my phone flashlight into the space between the drop ceiling and the slab. Empty. Dust, old wiring, the return pipe with my clamp on it. No marks of passage, no stains, no sign that anything had moved through that space repeatedly over the past few days. I climbed down from the chair. There were two possible explanations. The first was that the thing had left, gone out of the building the same way it had come in, through some access point I'd never located, and moved on to somewhere else. The second was that I was looking in the wrong place. Neither one gave me any relief. I called Ray and told him what I'd found, or what I hadn't found. He was quiet for a moment and then said that absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence, that I knew that the marks on my arm were evidence enough that something real had been in that building. I said I knew. I said I was going to file a request for temporary closure of the gym on grounds of structural maintenance, that I'd use the damaged ceiling panels as justification, that it would give me a few days without having to explain anything to anyone. Ray said it was the right call. I hung up, went to the front desk, told Deb I was going to need to close the gym for a few days because of a problem with the ceiling in the maintenance corridor, risk of falling material. She asked when the problem had shown up. I said I'd noticed it that morning. She looked at me again with that expression of someone deciding not to ask any more. Then she started calling the members with appointments the next day. I left the gym at 3 p.m, locking every entrance, checking every window. In the parking lot, before getting in my car, I looked at the building one last time. The side wall, where Marcus had photographed that shape leaning against it, was clean. Gray concrete, closed windows, nothing out of place. But there was a mark at the corner of the wall, near the rain gutter. A dark pressure about 8 feet up, like a shoulder pressed hard into a porous surface long enough to leave a trace. It had been outside. It had been waiting outside. The gym stayed closed for 11 days. The wildlife control inspection happened on the 5th day. 2 men, basic equipment, an hour and a half inside the building. They came out, wrote things on a form, said they found no evidence of active animal presence. They said there were signs that some medium-sized animal had possibly accessed the space through the ceiling at some earlier point, but that the access appeared to be inactive. They recommended sealing the ceiling and setting up camera monitoring. I signed the form. I didn't show them the photo Marcus had sent. I didn't show them my arm. I said nothing about the locker room, about the bench, about the heat under the door that first night. There was a version of events that fit on a form, and there was the real version, and those two versions had no way of occupying the same page. Ray was there for the inspection. He stayed quiet through all of it, asked a question or two about the ceiling access points, thanked the men when they left. Then he stood in the maintenance corridor for a while with his hands in his pockets. He said, well, that was that then. I didn't answer. I sealed the ceiling with heavier material, installed 2 cameras in the interior corridors, reinforced the side entrance with an additional bolt. 2 days of work, done in silence, without Deb, without Marcus. Marcus didn't come back. I sent the termination paperwork by email and he responded with one line saying he was leaving town for a while. I didn't ask where. The gym reopened on a Monday morning. Deb came back, the members came back. The routine came back with that unsettling ease that routines have. As if nothing had happened, as if the gap had been just maintenance after all, the way the form said. I worked normally for a few weeks. I checked the cameras every day before opening and after closing. Nothing. Ceiling intact, corridors empty, locker room with the bench in the right position every morning. The smell had disappeared completely. Chlorine, deodorant, old mildew, everything where it belonged. I started sleeping better. I started thinking that maybe the thing had actually left, moved on, found somewhere else. Ray called once a week. The conversations were short. He'd ask how the building was. I'd say it was normal. He'd say that was good. On one of those calls he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been looking through incident records within a 25-mile radius over the past several years. That he'd found 3 cases of domestic animals killed with wounds that the reports described as inconsistent with any predator known to the area. That all 3 cases had happened in different winters, with an interval of roughly 2 years between each one. I asked what year the next interval fell on. He didn't answer right away. When he did, he said only that it was an estimate, that it didn't mean anything concrete. I didn't bring it up again. It was the cameras that brought the problem back. Not dramatically. There was no night of terror, no break-in, nothing I could have shown anyone and said, look, here it is, this is proof. It was subtle, the way real things are subtle when they don't want to be found. In the recording from a Thursday in the early hours of the morning, the maintenance corridor appeared empty for hours, silent, static, the new foam ceiling panels undisturbed. But at 3:42 in the morning, for exactly 4 seconds, the camera recorded a temperature variation that the system rendered as an orange patch in the lower right corner of the frame, the kind of reading that shows up when there's a heat source near the sensor. 4 seconds. Then it was gone. I watched that segment about 20 times. The patch appeared, held still, disappeared. There was nothing visible in the frame. No shape, no shadow, no movement. Just heat. Concentrated at one point, at a height of about 8 feet off the floor. I sent the file to Ray without comment. He responded hours later with 2 words. I know. We didn't exchange anything else that day. I kept opening the gym, kept doing maintenance, answering emails, replacing bulbs, fixing what broke. The clamp on the return pipe held. I never needed to replace it. The hinge on locker 12 still catches when it closes. It's still on the list to lubricate. I still haven't lubricated it. The plastic bag with the fragment of the stain is still in the drawer. What changed was a small thing I noticed by accident, on an ordinary morning, opening the men's locker room for the routine check before the first members arrived. The bench was in the right position. Floor clean, lockers closed, no smell out of the ordinary. But in stall 4, the plastic curtain I always leave open for ventilation was drawn. Closed. I went over, opened it. Stall empty, wall clean, drain clean. Nothing. But on the back wall, on the tile where months earlier there had been that diagonal groove I'd run my finger along and felt the grout crumble to dust, there was a new mark. Not a groove, not a pressure mark. It was different from anything I'd seen in that space before. It was a sequence of shallow incisions in the tile, parallel, unevenly spaced, arranged in a diagonal line about 16 inches long, deep enough to strip the glaze off the ceramic and expose the porous material underneath. The kind of mark a claw makes when it drags slowly across a hard surface. It wasn't violence. It wasn't an attack. It was slow. Each incision with the same pressure, the same angle, the same approximate spacing. Like something had stood there, in the dark, with all the time in the world, dragging its claw across the wall without any urgency at all. I left the stall. I left the locker room. I sat in the front desk chair and stared at the empty corridor until Deb came in and asked if I was okay. I said I was. She hung up her jacket, turned on the computer, started the day. I kept staring at the corridor. That mark in the tile wasn't a message. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't any of those things because the thing that made that mark doesn't think in terms of messages or warnings. But there's a difference between something that passes through a place and something that comes back to the same place. And that difference carries a weight I still haven't been able to put in any drawer. The gym is open. I still work here.